Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. We begin in British Columbia, where cooler temperatures and a recent downpour of rain in BC's hot zones are providing some relief to firefighters in the hardest hit areas like the Okanagan and Shuswap regions.
We're seeing a reduction in fire behavior, except for some areas which are still proving challenging along the existing perimeter.
While some evacuation orders are starting to lift, patience is wearing thin. Authorities say streets are covered with branches and debris and want to ensure it's safe to return home. An online service has been set up for evacuees in Kelowna to check on the status of their homes. In the Northwest Territories, wildfire growth appears to have stalled, but flames are still a threat for Yellowknife and the communities of Hay River and Fort Smith.
We need to be patient. Many of these fires of concern haven't moved in several days. That's really good news, but it does not mean the situation is safe.
Crews continue to water bomb the fires from the air while digging barriers down to the forest's dirt floor to stop the flames from spreading. Hot, dry conditions have increased fire activity near Fort Smith. There's no rain in the forecast for the rest of the week. The Liberal government's cabinet retreat in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island wrapped up on Wednesday. And there were a lot of items on the agenda, including the fires currently ravaging British Columbia and the Northwest Territories, as well as the housing crisis. Joining us today to talk about the retreat is Minister of Indigenous Services, Patty Hajdu. She joins us from her constituency in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Minister Hajdu, thanks for taking some time for us here.
Oh, happy to be here. Thanks very much.
So first off, the fires in BC and the Northwest Territories, what sort of supports is the government offering for affected First Nations communities?
Well, we're working really closely, first of all, with the provinces and territory to make sure that there isn't any people left behind. And so the first thing I would say is that Indigenous Services Canada has partnerships, and depending on the province or territory, it might look different. For example, in BC, most of the emergency management is handled directly through the First Nations Emergency Services, which is funded by the federal government, but then provides a First Nations led approach to emergency management. We're supporting evacuees, we're supporting communities. Of course, we're supporting with additional costs, we're supporting with cash flow, and we're also supporting with the needs that many evacuees have. And I'm sure you've been hearing those stories of people having to leave very quickly, not having their medication, perhaps not having their essential items like hearing aids and glasses and all kinds of different things, including the ongoing mental health support for people that are living in such precarious situations.
Well, moving to some budgetary issues, the Treasury Board has mandated each minister find $15 billion in savings. How do you plan to find these savings in your department?
Yeah, so it's $15 billion overall. Each department is responsible for contributing to a reduction in spending to that amount. And so I've had ongoing conversations with the Deputy Minister who is responsible for the operations of Indigenous Services Canada. And my focus is on looking for those efficiencies that I know we can find. There are many different ways that we can be more efficient, that we were very innovative in COVID and coming up with fast and effective systems to do things that we had never done before. And I'm certain we can do that again through this lens. So, for example, there are programs that have a high need for a lot of eyes. I'm thinking of Jordan's Principle, for example, and that Jordan's Principle delays have been in the news lately. So, looking at ways that we can be more efficient in processing claims, whether it's in batches or whether it's in a more proactive way that gets money out the door and does verification checks later. That's just one example that comes to the top of my mind, but certainly we're looking at every aspect of operating the department through the lens of creating those efficiencies and ensuring that we are really getting the biggest bang for our buck, if you could say that, in terms of getting services delivered to communities.
Should people expect there to be some cutbacks to program services?
I've been really clear that my direction to the deputy is that this cannot affect services for First Nations, and that obviously First Nations have a number. It's often when you think about the kinds of functionings that municipalities are obligated to provide their people, it's no different in First Nations. There are health considerations, there are education considerations, and infrastructure considerations, and services cannot be affected for First Nations people. We have to find these savings through efficiencies at the department level, so that people can feel confident that they'll have what they need to continue to deliver services for their members.
One, of course, long-standing issue has been housing on First Nations, which is now viewed as a crisis everywhere. But, it was one of the major topics at the retreat. What was discussed to address First Nations housing needs?
We've invested billions of dollars into First Nations housing, and of course, there's still a gap. But for every one house that the previous Conservatives built, we've repaired or built 9 more. So you can see the speed that we're operating at in terms of First Nations housing. And what I would say is that there's an opportunity to accelerate that work in every space, whether we're talking about Indigenous housing on reserve or whether we're talking about the new $4 billion fund for urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing. There are some exciting things happening in terms of accelerating the ability for First Nations to have autonomy about how those houses are built and what kind of structure they take. And so I'm excited about the conversations coming up. I know that it's a priority not just for every Canadian across this country, but it's a priority for our government to make sure that we can actually move more quickly with our partners, because quite frankly, we need our partners. We need to be, all of us at every level of government, and that includes First Nations level government, thinking about how we do things more quickly so that people have a safe roof over their heads.
Minister Heidi, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate you taking some time for us.
Appreciate it, Dennis. Thank you.
Our Truth and Politics panel's here to talk about the impact of the wildfires on First Nations. That and more coming up after the break. Welcome back. Well, as we continue to hear and see, 2023 has been the worst wildfire season on record in Canada. Currently, nearly 70% of the population of the Northwest Territories have been forced to evacuate. A report earlier this year found that it is Indigenous communities that are impacted the most by wildfires. For more on this, our weekly Truth and Politics panel is here. Carrie Benjo is the editor of Eagle Feather News, and Niigaan Sinclair is the columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Carrie, Niigaan, great to see you as always. Carrie, let's start with you. A number of studies released this year have found that what I think many First Nations on the ground would tell you, that Indigenous communities are impacted the most by wildfires. What are your thoughts on those findings?
It's pretty obvious. There's a lot of Indigenous people that are living in the northern regions, and when there is forest fires, their communities are the hardest hit, and they're the ones that are always having to evacuate. Earlier this year, I was in Saskatoon, and the entire hotels were booked up with Indigenous people, and they were just congregating in areas, and I know that they would much rather be at home. I've lived in the north. My in-laws lived in the north, and they didn't like coming to cities because they didn't like feeling like outsiders. And my heart goes out to all the ones that constantly have to do that because they're uprooting, and they leave without knowing if their home will still be there when they return.
Mm-hmm. Niigaan, it's not just fires, often it's floods. This report that was using data from a few years ago found that over the last 13 years, First Nations communities experienced more than 1,300 emergencies, leading to more than 580 evacuations, affecting more than 130,000 people. What do you make of those numbers?
Yeah, we make up 5% of the country, but 42% of evacuees just this year alone. You can imagine all the other floods, other climate-related disasters. I mean, it really proves that climate change is disproportionately impacting our communities. And we're really not just talking about property here, although obviously having your homes, your possessions, everything destroyed is devastating. We're also talking about the destruction of historical and ceremonial sites. We're talking about the trauma of removing people from communities and putting them in hotels, as Carrie talked about, which leads directly to substance abuse, suicide, depression, mental health issues, even leads to children in the child welfare system, because we know that when children and families are removed, they suffer stresses and endure more hardship, which results in children in the child welfare system. And what we're really talking about is an ongoing neglect of Indigenous rights, because we have traditional practices. We've been used to forest fires for centuries as Indigenous peoples, but because our practices were banned and outlawed, now just our simple issue of our rights, that the fact that we can handle forest fires in our communities, if we had infrastructure, if we had supports, if we had human resources in our communities, and we were supported to be able to handle this, we would have emergency services. Most First Nations don't even have an emergency service department because they're too busy dealing with issues of moldy housing, fresh water, issues of infrastructure. So, I mean, this is a much bigger issue, but it's really proof that climate change is disproportionately affecting our lives.
Indeed. Carrie, is the federal government doing enough to help prevent these types of things? And as Niigaan says, is Indigenous knowledge being used enough?
No, Indigenous knowledge is not being used enough. Like he said, there were traditional practices. There was burning of old areas to make for new growth, and it was common among the prairies and in areas, and they were able to manage traditionally. And when we're talking about whether or not the federal government is doing enough, I find issue with that, because it shouldn't just be on the federal government. Mm-hmm. The provincial government has a responsibility. The municipalities have a responsibility. It should be a shared responsibility among everybody, because Indigenous people are people. They're citizens of this country and this land. And yet whenever something happens, it's like, okay, they're the responsibility of the federal government, and it's all pushed onto them. And there's this idea that the federal government's going to come and have a solution, and then so everybody's standoffish and they don't give that support. Whereas if it was a municipality that was affected, the province, neighboring municipalities, everybody would jump in and help. But that doesn't happen for First Nations people because they're seen as a jurisdictional issue. They're the responsibility of the federal government, and nobody's doing enough.
Nigan, officials in the NWT have told us that this is going to be the norm for at least a few more years. Is this our new reality?
Yeah, undoubtedly. I mean, there's not enough being done to deal with the issue of climate change. And Carrie's right. I mean, a big gap here and a big problem is the role of the provinces. The provinces are spending copious amounts of resources, time, effort to reject carbon taxes, to reject regulations by the federal government to deal with the issue of climate change. I mean, the issue is really that the federal government is trying its best. I think, $1.8 billion invested in supporting climate change within communities, promising to have every First Nations with an emergency management plan by 2030. I mean, these are things that the federal government are attempting to do, but the provinces continue to leave First Nations, Métis communities, Inuit communities out of the planning for forest management and emergency services, which are their two responsibilities. So what ends up happening is that these communities are denied while, certain towns and villages are focused upon by the provinces. So guess who gets protected when it comes to the issue of forest fires and flooding and other issues related to climate change that happen all the time, soil degradation and so on. So what we see is we really see a big problem with the provinces right now. I'm not saying the federal government's doing everything or doing everything well, but I'm saying that they are taking action. There's a national adaptation plan that includes First Nations, and the consultations that took 2 years, the provinces are certainly doing much less, if anything at all.
Carrie and Egon, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate you both being here as always.
Yeah, you go ahead.
To other news now, where a Prince George BC RCMP officer who's already facing a manslaughter charge in the 2017 death of Dale Culver has now also been charged in a 2002 assault. The BC Prosecution Service approved the charge this week against Constable Paul St. Marie in connection with his involvement in an arrest last August. The BC Prosecution Service said in a media release it will not be commenting further on the alleged victim's identity or other details, as the matter is now before the courts. In February, Constable St. Marie and Jean-Francois Monet were charged in the death of Dale Culver. At their last court appearance in June, the constables pled not guilty. No trial date has been set yet, but it's expected to take place next year. This week, a retired Superior Court judge from Quebec was in Rankin Inlet, Nunavut, to hear historical allegations of child sexual abuse against Johannes Rivoire, a former Catholic priest. Andre Denny is leading the Oblate Safeguarding Commission. It was created by the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, who sent Rivoire to Nunavut for 30 years and will be reviewing how the accusations were handled. Rivoire is in France and told APTN News last year that he will not return to Canada to face one charge of sexual abuse. The French government has also refused to extradite Rivoire, as French law prohibits the extradition of its citizens. Denny has declined to comment until his report is complete. The Oblates have also declined to comment, saying the Commission's work is ongoing and independent from them. A community celebration in Sioux Valley Dakota Nation as Vegas Golden Knight Zach Whitecloud has his day with the Stanley Cup. That story and more still to come. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. Danielle snapped this photo of Sioux Falls, located in Sioux Falls Provincial Park, Manitoba. Thanks for sharing, Danielle. Well, have you been getting outdoors this summer? We want to see your photos. You can email them to us at share@aptn.ca to be featured as our next photo of the day. Now let's take a look at Friday's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, 23 for Halifax and Charlottetown. 13 with showers in Kuujjuaq, rain in Nain, and a high of 16. 22 with rain in Montreal, 19 with showers in Chibougamau. 21 with rain in Sault Ste. Marie, rain, and 25 in North Bay. Showers in Thunder Bay, and a high of 21. 19 with rain in Sioux Lookout. Sun's out and 19 for Norway House, 18 with rain in God's Lake. Rain and 22 in Winnipeg, Brandon, Gimli, and Dauphin. 22 with rain in Regina. Sun's out and 22 for Saskatoon. 23 in Meadow Lake, showers and 23 in La Ronge. In northern Alberta, smoke in Fort Chip with a high of 26. Smoke for Peace River and a high of 24. Edmonton will be smoky as well, 23 is the high. Sun's out and 22 in Lethbridge. Smoke and 23 for Vancouver, 27 and partly cloudy in Kamloops. Smoke and 24 for Prince George, a sunny 26 in Smithers. Showers and 13 in Old Crow, 22 for Whitehorse. Smoke and 25 for Yellowknife, 20 with showers in Norman Wells. 0 with snow in Sax Harbor, cloudy and 11 in Pawlatuck. 18 in Whale Cove, 20 for Arviette. +1 with snow in Resolute, flurries, and 4 in Arctic Bay. Wednesday was a special day for the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation in Manitoba. Zach Whitecloud had his day with the Stanley Cup and brought it home to share with his community. Our Daryl Stranger has more.
Cheers, laughter, and of course the Stanley Cup were on full display as Vegas Golden Knights defenseman Zach Whitecloud brought the Stanley Cup home. Hundreds gathered at the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation Powwow Arbor to see the cup in person and show their support for Whitecloud.
Congratulations! You did so good on the game.
We're very proud to be from Sioux Valley.
Perfect.
They put us on the map.
It's so neat to hear every once in a while on NHL. You hear Sioux Valley Dakota Nation, right? It was just loud. And I love that.
The day had plenty of celebration, including speeches, photos, traditional dances, and an appearance from the king of rock and roll.
What you have done, well, you made me love you now you're loving man is gone.
One common theme among those in attendance was the sense of pride within the community.
Definitely a great sense of community pride, and it's been there always and supporting them when we first started playing with the Vegas Golden Knights. But I think it's a lot more now than from the Stanley Cup, and we're hosting the watch parties and all the excitement leading up to today. There's been so much community pride in bringing together the community in such a good way.
Unity. We've never had unity in such a long time. He doesn't even know what his gift is to us. You know, he thinks bringing back the Stanley Cup is more than that. It's the unity and all the young people. There's lots of young parents here just enjoying the day, and they don't even care about the weather.
Much like who he is on the ice, Whitecloud's speech to those in attendance was simple yet effective.
Thank you everyone for taking the time to come and celebrate. A dream of mine since I was a little kid. So everyone travel safe, be well, and again, travel safe home when you head that direction.
Chief Bone said having a role model like Whitecloud is nothing but positive for the youth.
definitely an inspiration to the younger kids to be able to see, you know, an Indigenous role model playing in NHL and also winning the Stanley Cup, and being able to bring that to a First Nation community is definitely such a great accomplishment. And you know, you look, the younger people look up to him as a role model, and I think it inspires them to do better and to excel in their sports and education, and you know, to live that good life, and you know, that anything is possible and their dreams come true.
Daryl Stranger, APTN National News, Sioux Valley Dakota Nation.
What a great looking day that must have been. My favorite video from yesterday, though, is when Zach took the Stanley Cup to a 7-Eleven and drank a Slurpee out of it. You can find much more on the Cup's trip to Sioux Valley Dakota Nation on our website. That's aptnnews.ca. And for more on anything you've seen here or anything you've missed, you can visit the APTN News YouTube page. I'm Dennis Ward-Marcy. Thanks for being with us. We'll leave you now with some more from the celebration, including this incredible entrance, the celebration yesterday in Sioux Valley Dakota Nation. Have a great night.